By 1940, the world was already engulfed in flames. In Europe, Nazi Germany's Blitzkrieg had rewritten the rules of modern warfare, while across the Pacific, Imperial Japan was carving an empire out of Asia with ruthless efficiency. In just a few years, Japanese forces had seized Manchuria, China's eastern provinces, and the resource-rich islands of Southeast Asia. Their military confidence was unmatched, their infantry highly trained in jungle warfare, and their engineers adept at fortifying positions in difficult terrain. Amid this expansion, the United States was still finding its footing in armored warfare. American tanks of the early war years, the M2 and M3 series, were primarily light and medium designs. The M2, originally intended for training, could barely withstand heavy machine gun fire. The M3 Stuart, faster and slightly better armed, carried a 37mm gun that might intimidate lightly armored vehicles. But against entrenched Japanese anti-tank teams wielding 37mm and 47mm guns, it was almost laughably inadequate. Japanese soldiers, steeped in jungle combat, quickly identified the weaknesses of these early American machines. They dubbed them tin cans, fragile containers of men who could be destroyed with careful placement of mines or well-aimed shells. In the dense jungles of the Philippines, the Solomon Islands, and later the Marianas, tank crews faced near-constant peril. Roads were narrow, often little more than cleared paths through the canopy, making maneuvering difficult. Ambushes were frequent, and Japanese anti-tank squads exploited every ridge and river crossing. Soldiers would lie in wait, their ears tuned to the metallic rattle of tracks or the whine of engines. Early reports from frontline American commanders were grim. Tanks that were supposed to support infantry often became liabilities, drawing fire and exposing their crews. Beyond the technical deficiencies, there was a psychological component. Japanese infantry had trained for years in the belief that their enemy's armor was cumbersome and easily destroyed with ingenuity and courage. Tales of soldiers leaping onto tanks to jam tracks or placing satchel charges under Sherman hulls circulated through the ranks. Mockery was a form of morale, an assertion that no matter how industrially advanced the United States appeared, the jungle and determination could neutralize technology. Meanwhile, American military planners were aware of these limitations. Reports from early engagements in the Pacific highlighted the mismatch. Light and medium tanks were simply not built for the environment or the type of opposition they faced. The lessons of Europe, where German panzer divisions were dominant, had limited applicability in islands choked by dense vegetation, rivers, and cliffs. American designers began to understand that reliability alone would not be enough. Firepower and protection needed significant upgrades if tanks were to survive in this unforgiving theater. This context, Japanese confidence, early Sherman vulnerability, and difficult terrain, set the stage for a harsh but necessary evolution. The M4 Sherman, introduced in 1942, represented a new philosophy: mass production, mechanical reliability, and sufficient versatility to operate in multiple theaters. Its armor was thicker than previous American models. Its 75mm gun, capable of engaging most Japanese fortifications, and its suspension allowed for jungle trails and rough terrain. Yet even this new machine faced challenges. Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns remained lethal, and infantry teams equipped with magnetic mines and Molotov cocktails could still disable a Sherman with patience and precision. The dichotomy was stark. While America could produce tanks in quantity, Japanese ingenuity and tactical skill often neutralized these advantages. Soldiers mocked what they perceived as a lumbering, overconfident enemy. The early Sherman was a symbol of potential unrealized, a promise that, while mechanically sound, had yet to demonstrate dominance on the battlefield. It was within this crucible of jungle warfare, mockery, and survival that American military engineers began looking beyond simple reliability. Lessons from Europe, where British and German tanks had clashed with devastating effect, offered ideas for increasing firepower without sacrificing the Sherman's mechanical strengths. The stage was set for a transformation, a weapon that would command respect, silence ridicule, and alter the psychology of battle. By 1943, the United States had fully mobilized its industrial might. Factories churned out tanks, planes, and ships at an unprecedented pace. The M4 Sherman, the centerpiece of American armored strategy, rolled off assembly lines in droves. Its design emphasized reliability, ease of repair, and standardized production. Crews could swap engines, tracks, and armaments quickly, a vital advantage in the far-flung Pacific and later in Europe. Yet reliability alone could not win battles. Early deployments in the Pacific exposed persistent vulnerabilities. Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns could pierce the Sherman's armor at close range. Narrow jungle trails restricted maneuvering, often funneling tanks into predictable paths where ambushes waited. Even well-armored Shermans were susceptible to mines and improvised explosive devices. Crew after crew discovered that tactical errors or overconfidence could quickly turn a reliable tank into a death trap. American commanders recognized these shortcomings and sought solutions. Lessons from North Africa and Europe were illuminating. There, British and German tanks had engaged in fierce armored duels, and long-barreled guns capable of penetrating thick armor were proving decisive. The British, facing formidable German Panzer IVs and Panthers, had begun mounting their 17-pounder anti-tank gun on existing Sherman chassis. This hybrid, later known as the Sherman Firefly, combined the American tank's mobility and mechanical dependability with a weapon capable of destroying even the most heavily armored enemy vehicles. The Firefly concept did not emerge overnight. It required careful engineering. The original Sherman turret had to be modified to accommodate the longer, heavier 17-pounder gun. Recoil mechanisms were reinforced, ammunition storage redesigned, and the balance of the tank adjusted to maintain mobility. British engineers worked alongside American manufacturers, creating a solution that was both practical for mass production and devastating in combat. By the time Fireflies began arriving in combat theaters in 1944, they represented a leap in armored capability, one that the Japanese forces, who had long mocked earlier Shermans, could scarcely anticipate. Strategically, the introduction of the Firefly coincided with intensified Allied offensives in the Pacific. Island-hopping campaigns required both firepower and mobility. While American Shermans had struggled against fortified Japanese positions, the Firefly's 17-pounder gun could punch through concrete bunkers and destroy entrenched pillboxes from a distance. Jungle ambushes, once deadly, were mitigated by superior range and penetration, allowing tank units to support infantry more effectively and with reduced casualties. Japanese intelligence quickly noted the shift. Reports from forward units described a new, almost mythical weapon that seemed capable of annihilating positions that had previously withstood repeated assaults. The same soldiers who had once laughed at the tin cans now faced machines that demanded caution, coordination, and sometimes outright retreat. Morale, once a clear psychological advantage for Japanese troops, began to waver when the Firefly was deployed in numbers. The broader implication extended beyond any single battle. The Sherman Firefly represented the fusion of American industrial power and British ingenuity, a tangible answer to the mockery and limitations of earlier armored warfare. It highlighted a key lesson of World War II. Adaptability often outweighed raw numbers or initial confidence. Where Japanese soldiers had once exploited American weaknesses, the Firefly neutralized those advantages, forcing the enemy to confront a new reality on the battlefield. By mid-1944, the stage was set. The jungles of the Pacific, once a sanctuary for Japanese ambushes, were about to host battles in which the balance of power had shifted. American crews trained on reliable yet previously vulnerable Shermans now had a weapon capable of challenging the very doctrine of Japanese armored and infantry tactics. The mockery of the past was about to collide with the lethal innovation of the present, and the consequences would reverberate. Far beyond the mud and bamboo of any single island, the human element of armored warfare is often overlooked in historical accounts. For the men inside the Sherman tanks, every jungle trail and coral road was a gauntlet. Early crews endured the oppressive heat of the Pacific Islands, the constant whine of engines, and the omnipresent threat of ambush. Each mission was a blend of anticipation and dread. Japanese anti-tank teams were disciplined, patient, and deadly, waiting in camouflaged positions with 47mm guns and magnetic mines. For the tankers, survival often depended on split-second decisions: when to advance, when to halt, and when to coordinate with infantry. Psychological strain was immense. The knowledge that your metal box could be penetrated with a single well-placed shot, weighed heavily on soldiers' minds. Some tank crews developed rituals to manage fear, touching a lucky charm before entering a valley, rehearsing defensive maneuvers repeatedly, or writing letters to loved ones in case the worst happened. The arrival of the Firefly brought a subtle shift. Crews gained confidence knowing that their gun could now destroy enemy bunkers or anti-tank positions before those threats could strike. Fear did not vanish, but respect replaced mockery, and morale, once fragile, grew steadier. The Sherman Firefly was more than a tank. It was a technological statement. The base M4 Sherman had been a reliable machine, well-balanced, mechanically dependable, and easy to repair. Its 75mm gun could engage light fortifications and most Japanese armor. Yet against hardened positions or heavily armed enemies, it was inadequate. The British innovation of mounting the 17-pounder gun transformed this workhorse into a battlefield predator. Engineering the Firefly required meticulous adaptation. The turret ring had to be enlarged, the recoil absorbed by reinforced mechanisms, and the ammunition storage redesigned to fit the longer, heavier shells. The result was a tank that retained Sherman mobility while delivering unprecedented firepower. Crews reported the satisfaction of engaging enemies from a distance, reducing exposure to mines, ambushes, and close-range gunfire. In practical terms, technology gave men the ability to survive where previously survival had been uncertain. On the battlefield, the Firefly's gun could pierce reinforced bunkers and medium tanks, reshaping tactical possibilities and giving Allied forces a new strategic tool. For the Imperial Japanese Army, early Shermans were a source of amusement. Their doctrine prioritized infantry-led operations, often considering tanks as auxiliary support rather than decisive instruments of warfare. Japanese soldiers exploited the Sherman's limitations: poor armor, predictable movement, and vulnerability to 47mm guns. The mocking laughter of tin cans reflected confidence rooted in experience and environment. Japanese troops perfected ambush tactics, combining camouflage, terrain knowledge, and coordinated fire to neutralize mechanized threats. Yet the arrival of Fireflies challenged this doctrine. Soldiers who had grown accustomed to the easy vulnerability of Shermans now faced a new reality. The 17-pounder gun outranged most Japanese anti-tank weapons, could penetrate fortified positions, and forced changes in infantry tactics. Japanese commanders were slow to adapt. Many frontline units had no choice but to retreat or risk annihilation. What had once been an effective system of ambushes and psychological dominance suddenly faltered against mechanical innovation. The shock of facing a weapon that neutralized their strengths began to ripple through morale, leaving soldiers uncertain and leaders scrambling for alternatives. Leadership during this period required more than tactical skill. It demanded foresight and adaptability. American commanders in the Pacific initially faced the harsh reality of underpowered tanks and a formidable enemy. Decisions about tank deployment were critical: when to advance, how to coordinate with infantry, and how to minimize exposure to ambushes. The early lessons were painful, and losses were often steep. Yet commanders recognized the opportunity in technological adaptation. Allied leadership understood that industrial might alone could not guarantee victory. Tank innovation had to meet battlefield realities. Collaboration with British engineers produced the Firefly, integrating a long-barreled gun capable of neutralizing enemy fortifications. Leaders who embraced this adaptation altered the trajectory of the campaign. Tank units equipped with Fireflies were often given priority in assaults, assigned to spearhead operations, and used to breach fortified positions. These decisions reflected a new philosophy. Effective leadership was measured not only in strategy, but in the willingness to integrate technology to protect soldiers and achieve objectives. The psychological impact of the Sherman Firefly cannot be overstated. For American crews, early Shermans had been both a source of pride and a symbol of vulnerability. Facing ambushes and anti-tank squads, soldiers lived in constant tension, aware that a single shot could claim their lives. The Firefly's arrival shifted this perception. Its long-range 17-pounder gun allowed crews to strike first, to dominate engagements, and to regain a sense of control. Confidence replaced anxiety, and morale steadily improved across tank divisions. For Japanese forces, the psychological effect was equally profound, but opposite. Soldiers who had once mocked American tanks now confronted a weapon that negated their previous tactics. Ambushes became riskier, and the confidence born from early successes began to waver. Frontline reports documented surprise, confusion, and frustration at the new threat. Entire defensive strategies previously built on exploiting Sherman weaknesses now required reassessment. The shift in battlefield psychology, from mockery to caution, from fear to respect, would shape engagements for the remainder of the war. The Firefly exemplifies the power of innovation under pressure. British engineers faced a dual challenge: create a tank capable of countering formidable German armor in Europe, while ensuring that the solution could also operate effectively in the Pacific theater. The answer lay in combining the reliable M4 Sherman chassis with the potent 17-pounder gun. The engineering feat was substantial. The long barrel required a redesigned turret with extended recoil absorption. Ammunition storage had to accommodate larger shells without compromising crew safety. Mobility and balance were preserved, ensuring that the tank could traverse both European plains and Pacific jungles. On the battlefield, the Firefly's gun outranged nearly all Japanese anti-tank weapons, capable of knocking out fortifications and vehicles before they could respond. Its arrival redefined tank warfare strategy. Infantry coordination changed. Ambushes lost their predictability, and the psychological superiority of Japanese forces began to erode. The Firefly was not just a weapon. It was a statement, a tangible demonstration of adaptation, ingenuity, and the industrial and tactical synergy of Allied forces. The summer of 1944 marked a turning point in the Pacific theater. On the island of Saipan, a dense tangle of ridges, cliffs, and narrow paths challenged every Allied advance. Japanese forces, confident from years of tactical dominance, had fortified positions across hills and river valleys. For early Sherman crews, each step forward had been a gamble. Mines, hidden gun emplacements, and well-coordinated infantry squads had inflicted heavy casualties. The roar of a Sherman's engine no longer inspired fear. It was met with calculated fire and quiet derision. Then, in mid-June, Firefly-equipped Shermans arrived. Their 17-pounder guns gleamed in the sun, longer than any weapon the Japanese had encountered in the Pacific. Units were briefed carefully. The Firefly would lead assaults on fortified positions, engage enemy armor from distance, and support infantry in breaking entrenched lines. For the first time, American tankers could deliver decisive firepower without being exposed to immediate retaliation. The initial engagements were swift and brutal. At Banzai Cliff, a small contingent of Fireflies moved ahead of the infantry, targeting bunkers that had previously halted Sherman advances. With precise shots, the Firefly's gun pierced reinforced concrete and destroyed emplacements from over 1,000 meters away. Japanese defenders, who had once mocked the Shermans, watched in disbelief as positions they believed impenetrable were obliterated in moments. Panic spread through frontline units, disrupting command and cohesion. The effect was both tactical and psychological. Infantry following the tanks found their paths cleared. Ambushes became rare and often ineffective. Tank crews reported a newfound confidence, a sense of control previously unattainable in jungle warfare. The 17-pounder gun had shifted the balance. Where once Japanese ingenuity dominated, now technological adaptation and Allied leadership dictated the pace of combat. The impact extended beyond isolated battles. Across Saipan and neighboring islands, Japanese forces began to reassess defensive strategies. Units that had relied on close-range engagements now faced long-range destruction. Mortar and artillery teams adjusted positions often too late, as Fireflies engaged from vantage points beyond effective return fire. Reports from Japanese officers noted frustration and disbelief. American tanks, once clumsy and vulnerable, had become instruments of precision and terror. Firefly crews quickly learned to exploit the advantages of their weapon. Coordinated movements allowed multiple tanks to cover overlapping fields of fire. Infantry units could advance under the protection of these tanks, confident that enemy strongpoints would be neutralized before threatening close-range engagement. The battlefield transformed from a lethal guessing game into a controlled advance, where firepower dictated action and reduced uncertainty. Yet the transition was not instantaneous. Early Firefly deployments required coordination, training, and trust in the new technology. Crews had to learn the range and limitations of the 17-pounder gun, adjusting angles and calculating trajectories over dense foliage and uneven terrain. Commanders adapted their strategies, emphasizing long-range suppression and calculated movements rather than hasty, reactive assaults. Once mastered, however, the Firefly became a decisive force, turning the tide of battles that had previously favored Japanese tactical skill and familiarity with the terrain. By the end of June, the narrative on Saipan had changed. Where Shermans had once been mocked, Fireflies commanded respect and fear. Japanese troops, previously unshaken by armored threats, now faced a weapon that could nullify their advantages before they had the chance to strike. The island, a microcosm of the Pacific theater, had shifted from a battlefield of improvisation to one where innovation, industrial power, and leadership dictated outcomes. As summer progressed, the Firefly's influence extended beyond Saipan to the islands of Guam, Peleliu, and later Leyte. Each battle illustrated the same pattern. Japanese forces, long confident in their ability to exploit Sherman weaknesses, now confronted a tank capable of rewriting the rules. On Peleliu, the terrain was brutal. Jagged coral ridges, dense undergrowth, and hidden caves offered the Japanese defenders near-perfect natural fortifications. For months, American forces had struggled with attrition. Early Sherman units had been vulnerable to close-range attacks, and infantry advances were repeatedly slowed by entrenched positions. Then Firefly Shermans rolled onto the battlefield. With their 17-pounder guns, crews could target bunkers and caves from distances that rendered Japanese anti-tank weapons nearly useless. Concrete emplacements, once symbols of invincibility, were reduced to rubble under sustained, accurate fire. The psychological impact on Japanese troops was profound. Soldiers who had mocked earlier Sherman tanks were now forced into defensive desperation. Field reports described confusion as entire platoons lost cohesion when their primary defensive positions were neutralized before they could fire a single shot. Fireflies transformed ambushes from tactical advantages into liabilities. The predictable Sherman movement became lethal only when paired with a Firefly's long-range precision. Leyte offered another dramatic example. Japanese armor had been almost non-existent, relying instead on infantry-led resistance and kamikaze tactics. Firefly-supported assaults allowed American forces to advance rapidly through fortified villages and mangrove swamps. Infantry moved with unprecedented confidence, using tank fire to neutralize enemy positions that had once stalled assaults for days. Even entrenched artillery crews who had dominated early Sherman advances were forced to relocate or face annihilation. Across the battlefield, the sense of Japanese dominance crumbled. The operational success of the Firefly was compounded by the strategic doctrine implemented by Allied commanders. Fireflies were deployed in spearhead roles, tasked with clearing fortified paths and providing long-range suppression, while standard Shermans and infantry followed. The synergy between units created a cascade of effectiveness. Infantry advanced, artillery targeted remaining positions, and Japanese defenders were systematically neutralized. What had once been chaotic engagements became controlled, methodical operations. Beyond the battlefield, the effect rippled through morale. American tank crews reported renewed confidence, a psychological edge that had been absent during early Pacific campaigns. The Firefly became a symbol of reliability, lethal force, and innovation. Japanese soldiers, in contrast, experienced a deepening sense of vulnerability. Units previously proud of ambush tactics and jungle mastery found themselves overpowered by firepower they could not counter effectively. Mockery had turned to fear, and pride gave way to caution and retreat. By late 1944, the Firefly had decisively altered the balance of armored warfare in the Pacific. Where Japanese forces had once dominated jungle engagements through terrain mastery and tactical ingenuity, American forces now commanded both mobility and firepower. The psychological advantage had shifted irrevocably, and the stage was set for the final phases of the island-hopping campaign. Battles that had previously relied on ingenuity and courage were now dominated by innovation and coordinated firepower. The Firefly was no longer just a tank. It was a symbol of the transformation of war itself, a tangible proof that adaptation and engineering could overcome mockery, fear, and entrenched assumptions. As the Firefly's impact became undeniable, the consequences for Japanese forces were clear. The era of mocking American tanks had ended. Survival on the battlefield would now require more than courage. It demanded adaptation to a weapon whose range, power, and precision made previous tactics obsolete. The transition from laughter to fear was complete, and the Pacific theater would never be the same. The deployment of the Sherman Firefly left an unmistakable mark on the Pacific theater. On islands like Saipan, Peleliu, and Leyte, Japanese forces suffered not only material losses but a profound psychological blow. Bunkers that had once withstood repeated attacks crumbled under the Firefly's 17-pounder shells. Infantry ambushes, previously effective against standard Shermans, became increasingly futile. Commanders on both sides took note. The balance of armored warfare had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. Casualty reports highlight the scale of the impact. Japanese units faced higher rates of loss among frontline infantry and artillery crews, as Firefly Shermans neutralized positions from a distance. For American forces, the improved survivability of tank crews and infantry reduced casualties compared to earlier engagements. The new synergy between mobility, firepower, and infantry coordination allowed Allied forces to achieve objectives faster, with fewer repeated assaults against hardened positions. Operational efficiency improved, and campaigns that had previously dragged on for weeks could be executed with greater precision and reduced attrition. The Firefly's psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. Japanese soldiers, once confident in their ability to control jungle engagements, began to experience doubt. Mockery of American tanks gave way to cautious fear. Reports from captured Japanese officers and post-war accounts detail the shock and disbelief at the Firefly's effectiveness. Units that had prided themselves on improvisation and tactical ingenuity suddenly faced an enemy that had adapted and overcome their strengths. Morale, a critical component of Japan's defensive strategy, began to erode under the weight of technological superiority. Allied leadership quickly recognized the operational advantage. Fireflies were integrated into standard tactics, leading assaults, supporting infantry advances, and providing overwatch in both jungle and urban terrain. Lessons learned in the Pacific were documented and shared across theaters, ensuring that the Firefly's effectiveness could be maximized in subsequent campaigns. Coordination between tank crews and infantry units improved, emphasizing communication, target prioritization, and calculated engagement distances. Where early Shermans had been vulnerable, the Firefly established dominance through a combination of range, firepower, and crew confidence. The Firefly also forced a reassessment of Japanese defensive doctrine. Reliance on ambushes and terrain mastery was no longer sufficient. Units faced the dilemma of either adapting to new threats or continuing tactics that would lead to predictable losses. In many cases, adaptation was impossible due to resource shortages, limited mobility, and entrenched command structures. The result was a series of retreats, abandoned positions, and in some cases near total annihilation of defending units. The psychological collapse was as significant as the material one. Soldiers who had mocked earlier Shermans now feared every tank, every rumble of tracks, and every flash of a long barrel emerging from the jungle. In the months following the Firefly's introduction, reports highlighted a stark shift in combat dynamics. Tactical victories became more attainable, offensive operations more controlled, and defensive failures more devastating. Commanders documented the effectiveness of combined arms tactics, Fireflies paired with standard Shermans, infantry, and artillery, as a blueprint for future engagements. The Pacific Islands, once arenas of grueling attritional warfare, were gradually brought under control with fewer repeated assaults, demonstrating the profound operational impact of the Firefly on both strategy and execution. The long-term effects of the Sherman Firefly extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. In the Pacific theater, Japanese forces struggled to recover from the shock of sustained armored superiority. Losses in men, material, and morale compounded over successive island campaigns. Defensive strategies, once rooted in confidence and ingenuity, faltered against a weapon whose precision and firepower could annihilate positions before defenders could react. The psychological advantage so critical to Japanese tactics had shifted irreversibly. Reports from Allied officers emphasized the broader lessons of the Firefly. Not only did it neutralize previously dominant enemy strategies, but it also demonstrated the value of adaptability, technological integration, and cooperation between allied nations. American forces, working alongside British engineers and strategists, had created a weapon that merged industrial efficiency with battlefield necessity. The Firefly became a template for future tank design, reliable, powerful, and capable of redefining tactical engagement parameters. Its impact was a practical lesson in how innovation could overcome numerical inferiority or entrenched enemy confidence. Technological ripples extended into post-war doctrine. The principles underlying the Firefly, combining mobility, protection, and long-range firepower, informed the design of subsequent American and Allied tanks during the Cold War. Concepts such as turret adaptability, enhanced recoil management, and long-range engagement priorities became standard considerations. Lessons learned in jungle and island warfare were translated into mechanized infantry operations in Europe and beyond, ensuring that the Firefly's legacy influenced armored doctrine for decades. The human cost, however, remained stark. Island campaigns had been devastating. Civilian infrastructure was destroyed, soldiers on both sides were killed in large numbers, and survivors carried physical and psychological scars for life. For American crews, the Firefly mitigated some dangers, but could not eliminate the inherent brutality of combat. For Japanese soldiers, the transition from mockery to fear marked a profound psychological defeat, compounded by isolation, exhaustion, and dwindling supplies. The Firefly was both a tool of survival and a harbinger of destruction. In terms of strategy, the Firefly shifted how battles were planned and executed. Japanese commanders could no longer rely on ambushes or terrain advantages alone. They were forced to disperse forces, abandon key positions, or attempt counterattacks that often failed against superior firepower. Allied forces, conversely, learned to coordinate tanks, infantry, and artillery with unprecedented efficiency. The synergy between technological innovation and battlefield strategy turned what had once been high-risk engagements into controlled, calculated operations. By the time the Pacific campaigns were concluding in 1945, the Firefly had achieved its ultimate objective. It transformed American armored warfare from a target of ridicule into a decisive instrument of victory. Where Japanese soldiers had once laughed at tin cans, they now faced a machine that demanded respect, recalculated tactics, and shifted the psychological balance of entire engagements. Its influence was measured not only in destroyed fortifications and vehicles, but in the intangible weight of fear and uncertainty it imposed on the enemy. The story of the Firefly's aftermath is thus twofold: a story of tangible success in battle, and a story of strategic, psychological, and technological transformation. It demonstrated that war was not merely a contest of numbers or bravery, but of adaptability, innovation, and the ability to integrate new tools into existing frameworks. The Firefly's legacy endured, shaping post-war military thought, inspiring tank design, and reminding history that technological mastery could turn mockery into respect and fear into opportunity. War is often measured in victories and losses, in maps redrawn and battles won. Yet the story of the Sherman Firefly reminds us that it is also measured in adaptation, ingenuity, and the subtle shifts of perception. Soldiers who once mocked the tin cans of early American armor faced a stark reality. Machines could evolve faster than assumptions, and technology could redefine courage, strategy, and survival. The Firefly was more than a tank. It was a symbol of resilience, the ability to learn from failure, to listen to the lessons of the battlefield, and to transform weaknesses into strength. Its 17-pounder gun did not merely destroy bunkers or vehicles, it altered the psychology of entire campaigns. Where once laughter echoed in the jungles and ridges, now caution, respect, and even fear prevailed. Human ingenuity had bridged the gap between mockery and mastery. Its legacy extends beyond the Pacific Islands. The Firefly informed the design of post-war armored forces, influencing doctrine, engineering, and battlefield strategy for decades. It showed that innovation is inseparable from necessity, and that technological adaptation can determine the course of history as decisively as numbers or bravery. Soldiers, engineers, and commanders alike were reminded that survival in war often depends on seeing beyond the present, on anticipating the next evolution before the enemy does. In the quiet aftermath of battle, amidst the ruins and echoes of conflict, the Sherman Firefly stands as a testament to human resolve. It embodies the principle that progress, when guided by intellect and courage, can overcome ridicule, doubt, and even fear. In its shadow, soldiers learned that machines could carry both destruction and hope, that innovation could rewrite assumptions, and that the line between vulnerability and dominance was often defined not by steel alone, but by the vision to wield it wisely. And so, from the jungles of the Pacific to the annals of military history, the Firefly remains a symbol, a reminder that in war, as in life, adaptation transforms weakness into power, mockery into respect, and uncertainty into triumph.